All right, welcome to episode number 12 of the Douglas Social Credit podcast. I'm Dr. Oliver Heydorn, and I'm joined once again by William Waite. And today we are going to attempt to provide you with a synthesis of or a summary of what Douglas Social Credit is all about. All right, we'll try to give it to you in a nutshell, which is not an easy thing to do, but it's would be, I think, helpful to a lot of people if we could provide them with some sort of summary synthesis of what it is all about. So the first thing that I'll say is that Douglas Social Credit's got four major aspects to it. Okay, it's got a social philosophy about the nature of society, of the individual's place in society. It's got a financial economic theory. And usually, when we talk about Douglas social credit, people are thinking of it in terms of that financial economic theory. And it has a political theory. Douglas also had a political analysis and proposals for political reform in the interest of the common citizen. And he also has a historical theory, right? Why things have happened the way they've happened over the centuries and where things are likely to continue if we maintain the current policies, financial, economic, political, in place. So it's got those four domains to it. Now, probably it would be too daunting to try to address each of those four. So I think what we'll do is we'll start off maybe focusing on the social philosophy a bit because it's important to understand where Douglas is coming from. And then we can move to the financial economic dimension of social credit. So the first point, I think, when it comes to the social philosophy is that social credit has a very distinct meaning in Douglas's thinking. And it's a term that describes a phenomenon that is a feature of all associations, of all communities, of all societies. When people associate together, whether it's in a family, a community, a nation, whatever it is, a company, a school, they do it because they're trying to benefit from the increment of association, right? Four people, to give a very simple example, four people can lift a box that one person on his own may not be able to lift, or they might be able to lift it more easily, more quickly than one person on his own would be able to lift. So that's why we associate, because by associating something new comes into existence, this increment of association, it's unearned. It doesn't belong to any particular individual. It sort of supervenes on the community itself, on the association itself. And therefore, Douglas thought that if that is the root motive for association, it is absolutely vital that the benefits of association are distributed to the individuals who make up the association on an equitable basis. That doesn't mean necessarily an equal basis, but in some basis that they'll want to continue with the association. There's enough incentive there for them to continue to associate because the association is fulfilling its purpose effectively, efficiently, fairly. And the one great danger that we have sometimes is that an oligarchy ends up taking control of the association and they end up imposing a policy on the association which deviates from the purpose of the association. And they basically start to operate as parasites, where they are using the association to their own advantage in an exclusive way that does damage to the original purpose of the association and which hurts the other members. So it's this parasitism, this oligarchic parasitism, which is always a danger whenever you have an association. And the whole idea of Douglas social credit is that we need to discern the institutions, the policies, the administrative forms, the regulations that are necessary in order to as best as we can, put associations on the straight and narrow so that they serve the individuals, they fulfill their original purpose well, and that they become immune or impervious to takeover from oligarchies, from these, parasites. Perhaps you want to add something to that description.
I suppose it's fair to say that there's always a risk of the individual being dominated when they associate in a group. It's not just that a certain association can be taken over by oligarchs necessarily, but that when people get into groups, the will of the individual can become dominated by perhaps the leadership of the group or the constitution of the group or whatever it may be. And Douglas was always very conscious of this fact, and that the merits of an association could be judged based on the satisfaction that it gives to the individuals in that association.
Mhm.
So the way that he, one of the ways that he assured that this would be the case was to, promote this idea or ensure that the freedom of association was built in, especially to economic association, so that if an individual felt that they weren't receiving the satisfaction they expected from the association, it was possible for them to just contract out
Mhm.
without suffering, you know, without becoming impoverished. To the extent the economic system was capable of delivering goods and services, which it is, in surplus, an individual should not be forced into especially an economic association against their ethical or moral judgment. So this
Mhm.
feature of ensuring that um, people are able to contract out of associations when they cease to satisfy the individual, and this decision has got to be at the level of the individual.
Mhm. Yes, no,
Um,
that's a very good point. In other words, Douglas held that individuals were more important than groups. The individual
mm,
occupies a higher place in let's say, the chain of being, a higher ontological place, and groups are metaphysically inferior. They only exist to serve the individuals who comprise them. So uh, that
and
means, as
and
you're
this
saying,
applies this applies also
dominant.
to systems.
Mhm.
So, like the capitalistic system or a socialistic system should not be able to victimize or damage the individuals that make that up in order to um, you know in order to ensure the continuation of the system. Systems were made for men, not men for systems.
Right. So that was one of Douglas's famous aphorisms: systems were made for men, men were not made for systems. And of course, it's got a sort of a foreshadowing in the gospel where Christ talks about uh, the Sabbath being made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So it's the same
Mm.
basic idea. It's a fundamentally Christian idea, really. Before we go too far, however, in what some might interpret as an anarchist position, I think in order to balance things out, we should also stress that every individual in an association also has a moral duty, if the association is serving his interests, not to attack the association, not to undermine the association, not to try to subvert the association, but to support the association so it can fulfill its purpose. In other words, an individual should not be engaged in antisocial activities. He should support the association if it's serving him, and not, create trouble just for the sake of. So yeah. Um, so if we take that as sort of the leitmotif, right? Associations, groups exist to serve the individuals who make them up. We are, of course, again, also not talking about the theoretical individual, and we're not talking about some individuals but not others. We mean the association is there to serve each concrete individual. right? Every single one of them. Um, and so if you've got large number of individuals who are not happy with the association, even though maybe a majority are, because it's not serving their needs, that's a problem,
Mm,
right?
absolutely.
Because ideally the system should be, or the association should be so constituted that, if it fulfills its purpose, like if it's an economic association, it's there to fulfill an economic purpose, the delivery of goods and services that people need to survive and flourish with the least amount of labor and resource consumption. If it fulfills that purpose well, then everyone should be satisfied, at least to some substantial degree. Everyone, not just some, but
Mm,
Um, so we take that as a leitmotif, right? Groups, associations, communities, provinces or states, nations exist to serve their individual members. Then we can look at the financial problem and the economic problem. And to tie it in with something we were discussing last week, uh, Douglas social credit in economic matters and financial matters is saying, first off, that the money system should be designed in such a way that it serves the individuals who make up society. It should not be designed in such a way that we are somehow serving the system, and by extension, the people who presently own, control, monopolize the system,
mm,
right? And that if we could implement that sort of arrangement, where again the individuals being served by the money system, by economic association, um, then the economy would be able to fulfill its purpose well, because you need a proper money system in order to do that. And interestingly enough, the one thing necessary to ensure the money system will serve the individual is that it's honest. That is to say, the picture that the money system paints of the physical world should be an accurate one. It should reflect reality. It shouldn't paint a picture that artificially limits or distorts reality, that then controls people.
mm. That's right, and it was. I suppose Douglas's main contribution in this area was to identify this gap between prices and purchasing power. So between aggregate prices coming out of industry and the amount of purchasing power made available to individuals to pay those prices. What this gap leads into um, is that people, whether it be businesses, government, individuals, are constantly required to return to private banks, private lenders, in order to borrow more money into existence, in order to fill this gap so that prices on goods coming from industry um, can be paid at the consumer level. Now, the remedy that Douglas suggested was twofold. There was the national dividend, which would be paid equitably to each citizen, um, or perhaps each household. And there was the compensated price discounts, which would, with the creation of the credit, which is not funded by creation of debt, the creation of the credit would not lead into an increase in prices because people would be compensated on the um, with consumer discounts. And
Right.
there are various ways to achieve that. But the idea being, as you said before, was to make the financial system honest. So what we have now is people get their purchasing power from wages, salaries, dividends, profits, but those profits are short. That's the gap. That's what the gap says. Those profits are short, and therefore, because there's not enough money in people's pockets, the perception is that we are poorer than we actually are.
Mm-hmm.
The money that we have for consumption is not equivalent to the real abundance that is actually there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and the purpose of the dividend and the price discounts is to bring purchasing power up to the level where goods can be purchased at the consumer level. And another one of Douglas's aphorisms was the purpose of production is consumption.
Mhm.
And that's quite logically true. I mean, what's the purpose of making something for the consumer if it can't be sold?
Mm.
Um, there are a number of reasons for the gap. We probably won't go into them now, but we could touch on some of them perhaps. And there are also many negative consequences associated with this gap as well, which
Mhm.
would be solved if we could institute Douglas's plan for the national dividend and the price discounts.
Yes, it's very it's a very interesting thing. We're basically saying, as far as the diagnosis is concerned, the money system isn't serving the individual because it's not an honest system. It doesn't accurately reflect reality. It doesn't reflect reality because it is imbalanced. It's a debt-only system that creates or generates an imbalance between the rate at which costs and prices are generated relative to the distribution of incomes. So it would be kind of like, I mean, this is a crude sort of image, but imagine that you were, uh, you had a cart that had two wheels in front or in the back. It doesn't matter where the wheels are, but one wheel is much smaller. Let's say the left wheel is much smaller than the right wheel. Um, the carts is structurally imbalanced, and our
Mm.
financial system is kind of like that. We're generating costs and prices at a faster rate than we're generating incomes, and this imbalance, if it's not addressed in along Douglas's lines with debt-free credit that actually creates a sort of homeostasis, if we fill it as we do now with more debt, government debt, business debt, consumer debt, it actually generates a long list of problems. So imbalance creates more imbalance, further
Mm.
imbalances, and further dysfunction. People can complain about inflation. Inflation is a result of this system of trying to fill the gap with debt money, right?
Sure.
People talk about instability, financial instability, periodic crisis when the debt gets to be too heavy and we can't borrow enough debt to pay what we owe. You have a financial crisis, then you wipe some of the debt out and you start over again. Right? I mean, there's a long list conflict, all sorts of social conflict, between workers and management and or between different types of citizens. I mean, you can even look at the social fallout of this in terms of men versus women, all these divisions that certain interested parties exploit when actually the basic fundamental core problem is the fact that the price system is not balanced. It's not automatically balanced. If you think about environmental problems, right, we have to keep on growing the economy in order to get enough debt into the system to achieve equilibrium. So this cancerous economic growth, it's not growth for its own sake necessarily because we actually want or need the extra production, but we have to find additional ways to distribute income because the system does not automatically supply a sufficiency. And that means that there's more pollution associated with that additional production, which perhaps we don't really even want or need, which is waste. There's more destruction of habitats, of consumption of resources. So, anyone who has any genuine concern for the environment should support Douglas social credit because the financial system is what is driving, directly or indirectly, all of our environmental problems. You see, so and we can go on and on. I mean, there's a long list of things we could talk about. You name the
Probably
issue. There's a
something
financial.
that should get something that should get special mention though, because it's so central to the problems that the world faces now, is this the tendency for this system to centralize power in the hands of unaccountable institutions. and I'm thinking mainly here about the banks. Okay, so this gives those who issue the debt enormous say in the direction that social organization takes.
Right.
People are lamenting all the time. Why do we get this? Like in Australia, we're going to spend $340 billion on submarines,
Mhm.
and this is not a demand on nuclear submarines. This is not a demand that's arisen democratically from the population. This is something that the government and the banks have decided that they're willing to fund.
Mm, mm.
Um, so I mean, that's just an example of how it just gives enormous power to financial institutions, far beyond their proper place.
Right. So we've got a technical problem that prevents it from serving the individual, but then here comes that whole dimension of the oligarchy, the parasitical oligarchy, because the system only allows us to fill it with debt, and because that debt is not issued for free, there are service charges, interest charges. The debt is also only issued if it suits the policy objectives of the issuers as well. So you have a system which, on the other end of it, is actually centralizing wealth, power, and privilege in the hands of those who own and operate the monopoly of credit, which then creates a whole set of other problems, right? And it has political implications because when you're that wealthy, you can buy politicians, political parties, media, so on and so forth, right? Um, if people follow this thread from A to Z, they'll be amazed at how many things that people take issue with or complain about, even things that they don't even recognize but are nevertheless deleterious, are caused directly or indirectly by this imbalance in the price system and how we fill it in a way that empowers this oligarchy, which is why, of course, they don't
and,
want to
and disempowers the individual,
disempowers the individual. Yeah.
as well. So, I mean, like everyone recognizes the power of money,
Mm,
and at the basis of it, our proposal is, well, do we vest that power in an unaccountable financial oligarchy, or do we distribute that power
hmm To the individual.
to the individual and empower the individual to take initiative, empower the individual to act on their own behalf
Yeah.
rather than supporting this system that it makes so many individuals are just made tools
hmm
of the system or of a powerful boss or of a government, and their own individual inclinations, morals, ethics, and so on just cannot be brought to bear on what they're
Right.
being made to do, because they have to answer to the man, they have to answer to the money system, essentially.
Right. So the bad news is, for technical reasons, there is this structural gap between prices and incomes. The good news is that instead of filling it with debt, with all the problems that entails, we could actually have it filled with debt-free credit, distribute that in favor of the consumer through the dividend and the discount, and actually empower the individual in a way that would be fantastic. I mean, it would be something unprecedented in human history, really, and it would change social relations. It would change the culture. It would change politics. It would change the whole trajectory of civilization because for the very first time, you'd have an arrangement where the individual is occupying the commanding heights of the economy.
Yes, and it's
Yeah.
just it's distributed in an equitable fashion across individuals in a given
Right.
population.
Right. So it's
Yeah.
the decentralization of power. In this case, Douglas social credit represents the decentralization of money power, of economic power. And, if I touch a little bit on Douglas's theory of history, he said civilizations fall because power becomes too centralized. The monopolists take too much and then they want it all, and then they risk killing the goose that lays the golden egg. So it's
Mm.
from this excessive centralization, concentration of power that civilizations have fallen apart in the past and is falling apart now. And so what we need to do is move in the opposite direction where we distribute power, decentralize power, And that will lay the foundation for a successful, stable, happy, flourishing society. And that's what Douglas Social Credit is all about.
That wasn't too bad.
Great. So our website, socred.org and thepeoplescredit.com.au. Please like and subscribe, and we shall see you again next week.
For now.
Bye-bye.
We've had less than a minute, for more than a minute, I would